Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. In a city where success is built on a fragile balance between wealth and injustice. Federal Judge Omar Jackson believes he has climbed above the prejudice that once defined his life. But when a routine drive home takes a chilling turn, Omar is forced to confront a hidden truth about the system he's spent his life upholding. As he unearths secrets that run deeper than he ever imagined, Omar finds himself entangled in a battle for justice that threatens not only his career, but his very sense of identity. What begins as a moment of personal injustice spirals into a fight that could change the course of his life and the city forever. If this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and listen to the full story. And if you've experienced something similar, don't hesitate to share this story with others. It might inspire them too. Chapter 1. Flashing Lights. The night had a stillness to it, a strange kind of quiet that made the air feel heavier. Omar Jackson's Tesla hummed softly as it glided through the quiet suburban streets. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the well-maintained lawns and tall manicured trees lining the road. It was late, later than Omar would have liked to be driving home, but the day had stretched out in ways he hadn't anticipated. As a federal judge, Omar's days were often long, filled with paperwork, hearings, and the burden of decision-making that held people's futures in his hands. Tonight, however, he felt that familiar tug of exhaustion not just from his work, but from life itself. His wife, Leah, had been growing frustrated with his late nights, and he had missed yet another one of Malik's basketball games. Their son was 14, at that crucial age where the line between boy and young man blurred. Omar had promised himself that he'd be more present, but here he was again, driving home after everyone was likely asleep. As his mind wandered between thoughts of tomorrow's court cases and the quiet guilt that gnawed at him, the flash of red and blue lights illuminated the rearview mirror. Omar's pulse quickened. For a brief second, he thought he had imagined it, the lights, the unmistakable color that every black man in America dreads seeing behind them at night. But then the lights pulsed again, more urgent, the high-pitched wail of the siren following a second later. There was no mistaking it now. He glanced at the dashboard. No speeding, no illegal turns, no broken lights. He was doing everything right. A wave of frustration bubbled up inside him, but it was muted by a familiar cold dread that settled in his chest. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. The rules always felt different for him. Sighing heavily, Omar signaled and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. He switched off the music and rolled down his window, keeping his hands on the steering wheel, making sure they were clearly visible. After years of navigating life in a black body, especially as a man in power, Omar knew all too well how quickly a simple interaction could spiral out of control. The police cruiser stopped behind him, its lights flashing in an almost hypnotic pattern. Omar's heart thudded in his chest as he caught a glimpse of the officer stepping out, illuminated by the rotating lights. A tall woman, mid-30s by the looks of her, strode toward his car. She held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the back seat, lingering on the plates, and then finally landing on him. Omar squinted as the light hit his eyes. "License and registration," she said, her tone flat and devoid of warmth. Omar could see her name tag, Clark. He didn't move immediately, his fingers hovering just above the glove compartment. He wanted to ask why he was being stopped, but he already knew how that question would be received. Instead, he slowly reached for his wallet, careful to make no sudden movements. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to her. The flashlight didn't leave his face as Officer Clark took the card from him. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Omar asked, his voice calm, practiced. He had been in situations like this before, too many times in fact. "We got a report of a suspicious vehicle in the area," she replied curtly, barely glancing at the license. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his tailored suit, the clean lines of the Tesla. "A suspicious vehicle?" Omar repeated, his patience wearing thin. He knew where this was going. "I live just up the street. This is my neighborhood." Clark's expression didn't change. She stepped back and clicked her radio. "Unit 45, I'm going to need backup." "Backup? For what?" Omar felt the muscles in his neck tighten. He had done nothing wrong. This was profiling, plain and simple. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he felt the familiar rage simmer beneath the surface. No matter how high he climbed, no matter how many degrees or titles he earned, moments like this reminded him of a cold truth. To people like Clark, he was just another black man in a nice car, in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. He opened his mouth to explain who he was, but before he could speak, Clark interrupted. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Omer froze. He felt his pulse quicken, his hands tightening on the wheel before slowly relaxing. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being asked to step out of his car in front of his own home. The urge to fight back, to argue, to assert his rights surged through him, but he knew better. He had seen too many men push down this path before. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The night air was cooler than he expected, biting at his skin. He raised his hand slightly, a small gesture, but one born out of years of knowing what could happen in these situations. The last thing he needed was for this to escalate into something worse. Clark's eyes didn't leave him, and Omer could feel her suspicion. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was nobody. As he stood beside the car, Omer could hear the distant hum of a second police cruiser approaching. "Back up. For what?" The second car pulled up, its siren briefly flashing before dying out. Omer watched as a man stepped out, older, more experienced, with the tired look of someone who had been on the force for too long. His name tag read, Captain Marcus Roberts. Roberts approached, his eyes shifting from Omer to Clark. "What's the situation here, Officer Clark?" "Suspicious vehicle, sir," Clark responded, her voice clipped. "Professional. I was just about to run his plates." Roberts's gaze lingered on Omer for a moment longer, and then recognition dawned. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait. Judge Jackson?" Clark blinked in surprise, glancing back at Omer. "Judge?" Omer met Roberts's eyes, his face unreadable. "Yes, Captain. That's me." Roberts immediately stepped forward, the tension in his body language easing. "Judge Jackson, I apologize. There must have been some mistake here." Omer didn't move. He had no intention of making this easy for them. "Mistake," he said, his voice tight. "I was pulled over for being suspicious in my own neighborhood, and now I'm standing outside my car, being treated like a suspect." Clark stiffened, looking between Omer and Roberts, her confusion evident. She had clearly expected something else, a criminal, a suspect, but instead, she had stopped one of the most respected judges in the city. Roberts sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is all a misunderstanding, Judge Jackson, I assure you." Omer stared at him, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him now, watching from behind their windows. They were probably already gossiping about what had happened, how a federal judge had been pulled over like a common criminal. But the worst part, the part that stung the most, was that he knew this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was systemic, and it wasn't going to change unless someone did something about it. Without another word, Omer walked back to his car, his movements measured and calm. He didn't need their apologies. He needed justice. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it. Chapter 2: Fractured Trust. Omer awoke the next morning to the scent of coffee drifting through the house. The sun filtered in through the blinds, casting soft rays across the bedroom. He lay still for a moment, his mind replaying the events of the previous night, the knot of anger and frustration still coiled in his chest. He had been here before, too many times to count, treated with suspicion, stopped, questioned. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the fact that it had happened in front of his own house, or maybe it was the sight of his neighbors peering out from behind their curtains. Whatever it was, the anger hadn't dissipated overnight. Leah was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She stood at the stove, her back to him, flipping pancakes for the kids, who were already seated at the table, giggling over some joke Malik had made. It was a typical Saturday morning, calm, domestic, the sort of scene that Omer had worked so hard to provide for his family. But the peacefulness of it all felt at odds with the turmoil in his chest. "Morning," Leah said as she turned, a smile on her face. But when her eyes landed on him, the smile faltered. She knew him too well. "You okay?" Omer forced a small smile and nodded. "Yeah, just..." Tired. Leah's brow furrowed. She could see right through him. You got home late last night. He sat down at the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Yeah, got pulled over on the way back. Leah stilled, the spatula in her hand frozen mid-air. Pulled over? Omer nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid swirling in his cup. They said I looked suspicious. Leah set the spatula down with a sharp clatter. Are you serious? Again? Omer didn't look up. Yeah, but Captain Roberts showed up, recognized me, told them to let me go. For a moment, there was silence. The kids were too busy arguing over who got the last pancake to notice the tension that had settled over the room. But Leah was staring at Omer, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. This isn't right, Omer, she said quietly. This keeps happening. Omer sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew she was right, but what was he supposed to do? It wasn't like he hadn't fought for justice his entire career. He had seen it all. The racial profiling, the systemic bias, the way the law was twisted to fit the narrative of those in power. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to trying to make the system better, but last night had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. He had felt powerless, standing there on the side of the road, trying to explain to someone who had already made up their mind that he wasn't a threat. He had felt like he was 17 again, being pulled over in his old neighborhood for driving while black. What am I supposed to do, Leah? He asked, his voice heavy with frustration. I'm a judge, for God's sake, and they still treat me like a criminal. Leah walked over to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. You're not just a judge, you're Omer. You're a black man in America, and they're never going to let you forget that. Omer clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had spent so many years trying to rise above it all, trying to believe that his success would protect him. But last night had shattered that illusion. You can't let them get away with this, Leah said, her voice firm. You have to do something. Omer shook his head, the frustration mounting. What do you want me to do, Leah? Sue the police department? Make a scene? I have a family to protect. Leah's eyes softened, but there was a fierce determination behind them. I know you want to protect us, but if you don't stand up for yourself, for us, what message are you sending to Malik and Alana? That we just accept this? Omer looked over at his son, who was now laughing as he stuffed a pancake into his mouth. Malik was only 14, but he was already becoming painfully aware of the world he was growing up in. He had his father's height, his dark skin, and his sharp mind. Omer could already see the wheels turning in his son's head, questioning things, piecing them together. He didn't want Malik to live in fear. He didn't want him to internalize the idea that no matter how hard he worked, how high he climbed, he would always be judged by the color of his skin. Leah was right. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't keep brushing it off, telling himself it didn't matter because it did. If not for himself, then for his kids. I'll look into it, he finally said, his voice low but resolute. Leah smiled softly, squeezing his shoulder. That's all I ask. But as Omer stared into his coffee cup, a gnawing feeling of dread settled in his chest. This wasn't going to be easy. If he pulled on this thread, who knew what kind of mess he would unravel? Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. The idea of doing something about the incident gnawed at Omer over the next few days, consuming his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an isolated case. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized how often these routine stops happened, not just to him, but to people across the city. Black men, especially. Leah had urged him to act, and after a few days of stewing in his thoughts, Omer knew she was right. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about something much bigger, a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. It was time to start investigating. Omer sat down at his desk in his home office one evening, staring at the computer screen in front of him. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling or the distant hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. He knew that once he started this, there would be no turning back. He would be diving headfirst into a mess that could threaten everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his family's safety. But he couldn't stay silent. He started with his own case, pulling up the police report from the night he was stopped. As expected, the report was sparse, filled with vague language, suspicious vehicle reported in the vicinity. There was no mention of any specific infraction, no reason for why he'd been pulled over. It was the kind of report that could easily be brushed off as routine. But Omer knew better. He had been on the other side of this too many times. He began digging deeper, pulling records from other incidents that had occurred in his neighborhood in similar affluent areas. The pattern was clear. Black men, often driving expensive cars, or simply walking through predominantly white neighborhoods, were being stopped at an alarming rate. The language in the reports was almost always the same: suspicious behavior, possible suspect, fit the description. The more he uncovered, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a few bad cops making mistakes. This was systematic. It was built into the way the police department operated, ingrained in how they viewed people like him. And then there were the complaints, dozens of them, filed by black residents over the years, alleging racial profiling, harassment, and unjust treatment by the police. Most of them had been dismissed without investigation, buried in the department's bureaucracy. No one was held accountable. Omer's pulse quickened as he sifted through the reports, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he dug deeper into the city's public records. He wasn't just looking for patterns anymore, he was looking for names. The same officers kept popping up in the reports, officers who had a history of targeting black men in wealthy neighborhoods. One name in particular stood out: Officer Jennifer Clark. Clark had been involved in multiple incidents over the past year alone. Each time, the report would end the same way: no charges filed, no follow-up, just a note that the stop had been justified based on reasonable suspicion. It was infuriating. But Omer wasn't done yet. He started looking into Officer Clark's background, hoping to find more information about her past. What he uncovered shocked him. Clark wasn't just another cop with a racial bias problem. She had ties to a local real estate developer who had been pushing to gentrify certain areas of the city. The developer, Matthew Garrison, had been quietly buying up properties in black and Latino neighborhoods for years, often using underhanded tactics to drive out the existing residents. It didn't take long for Omer to connect the dots. Garrison was paying off cops like Clark to harass residents, making their lives difficult until they eventually left. Once they were gone, Garrison would swoop in, buy the property at a fraction of its value, and then resell it for a huge profit once the neighborhood had been cleaned up. The realization hit Omer like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. This was about corruption. And it went far deeper than he had ever imagined. Omer leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had stumbled upon something huge, something that could shake the entire city if it ever got out. But he also knew the risks. Going up against someone like Matthew Garrison wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially life-threatening. Garrison was powerful, well-connected, and ruthless. If he found out that Omer was digging into his business, there was no telling what he might do to silence him. Omer's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. He needed help. This was too big for him to handle alone. After a few moments of hesitation, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Daryl, it's Omer. I need your help. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it." Chapter 4. The Turning Point. Daryl Jefferson picked up on the second ring. Omer hadn't spoken to him in years, not since law school, but they had always kept in touch, albeit loosely. Daryl had gone down a different path after graduation, working as a civil rights lawyer, taking on high-profile cases that challenged systemic racism in the criminal justice system. If there was anyone who could help Omer navigate the legal quagmire he was about to step into, it was Daryl. "Long time no hear," Daryl said, his voice warm but cautious. He knew that a call out of the blue from Omer meant something serious. Omer didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I've uncovered something big, Daryl. Corruption in the police department. I think it's connected to a local developer, Matthew Garrison. He's using the police to harass black residents in gentrifying neighborhoods. I've got reports, data, names, but I can't do this alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Daryl had heard similar stories before, cops working hand in hand with developers to push people out, but rarely did anyone have the evidence to prove it. "I'm listening," Daryl finally said. "But if what you're saying is true, you're going to be stepping into a war zone. Garrison is a dangerous man. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Omer glanced out the window, watching as Malik dribbled a basketball in the driveway. Leah was sitting on the porch, her eyes following their son's movements. They didn't know what he had uncovered yet, and part of him didn't want them to. But the other part, the part that had spent years fighting for justice, knew that there was no turning back now. "I don't have a choice," Omer said, his voice steely with resolve. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've been targeting. I'm not going to let them get away with this." Daryl let out a low whistle. "All right then, let's do this." Over the next few weeks, Omer and Daryl worked tirelessly to build their case. Daryl's legal expertise and connections proved invaluable, allowing them to access records and files that Omer hadn't been able to get on his own. Together, they compiled a mountain of evidence, police reports, financial records, even witness statements from residents who had been harassed by officers like Clark. But as the case grew, so did the risks. Omer started noticing things. His phone would ring late at night, but no one would be on the other end. His email was hacked multiple times, forcing him to change his password over and over again. And then there were the cars, black SUVs that seemed to be parked outside his house more often than not. At first, he thought it was just paranoia, but the more it happened, the more convinced he became that someone was watching him. He didn't tell Leah about the cars. She had already been through enough, and the last thing he wanted was to scare her. But the strain was beginning to show. Leah could sense that something was wrong, even if Omer wasn't telling her everything. "You've been distracted lately," she said one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "What's going on?" Omer hesitated, his gaze fixed on the basketball hoop at the end of the driveway. Malik had gone inside, but the ball still lay abandoned on the ground. "I've been looking into what happened the other night," Omer finally said, "and I've found something big." Leah turned to face him, her eyes narrowing with concern. "What do you mean?" Omer took a deep breath and began to explain everything. Officer Clark, the gentrification scheme, Matthew Garrison, the harassment of black residents. By the time he was finished, Leah's face had gone pale. "This is dangerous, Omer," she said quietly. "You're talking about some very powerful people. What if they come after us?" "They already are," Omer admitted, his voice low. "But I can't stop now, Leah. If I don't do something, no one will. And this will keep happening, to us, to our neighbors, to people who can't fight back." Leah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally she nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Then we'll fight, together." But the danger wasn't just from outside forces. Inside the police department, cracks were starting to form. Not everyone was willing to play along with the corruption, and one of those people was Officer David Silva. Silva was a relatively new officer, having joined the force just a few years ago. He had grown up in a working-class Latino neighborhood, and he had joined the police force with the intention of making a difference. But it didn't take long for him to realize that the system was more broken than he had imagined. Silva had seen the way officers like Clark operated, how they targeted certain people, how they manipulated reports, how they got away with things that should have been career-ending. At first, he had kept his head down, not wanting to rock the boat. But as the corruption became more blatant, it became harder to ignore. One night, Silva found himself patrolling the same neighborhood where Omer lived. He hadn't been part of the stop that night, but he had heard about it. The department was buzzing with rumors. How Officer Clark had nearly arrested a federal judge. How Captain Roberts had stepped in just in time to prevent a PR nightmare. But it wasn't the first time Clark had pulled a stunt like that, and it wouldn't be the last. Silva pulled his cruiser to a stop at the end of the street, his eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. It was peaceful now, but he knew that peace was fragile. He had to do something. Later that night, after his shift ended, Silva made a decision. He knew it was risky. If anyone found out, it could cost him his job, or worse. But his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent any longer. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized weeks ago. "Judge Jackson? This is Officer Silva. We need to talk." Chapter 5: The Media Storm. Officer David Silva didn't sleep well the night after he made the call. For years he had played the part of the good cop, staying out of trouble, keeping his head down, and minding his business. But after his conversation with Omer, everything had changed. He had crossed a line, one that he knew could never be uncrossed. He had become a whistleblower. Omer and Daryl had asked Silva to meet them in person, away from prying eyes, and now, in the dim light of an out-of-the-way coffee shop, Silva sat across from the two men, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. The weight of what he was about to reveal pressed heavily on his chest. "You're sure this is safe?" Silva asked, glancing around nervously. Omer nodded. "I've checked. No one's following you." Silva wasn't convinced. He had spent enough time in the department to know that eyes were everywhere, and ears too. But he had made up his mind. There was no going back. "We need to know everything you've seen," Daryl said, his voice steady, his notepad already open, pen poised. "Anything that can help us build this case." Silva hesitated, his eyes dropping to his coffee cup. He had never imagined himself sitting across from a federal judge and a civil rights attorney, spilling secrets that could destroy his career and possibly his life. But as he thought about the people he had sworn to protect, the innocent residents being pushed out of their homes, harassed by officers like Clark, he knew he had to speak. "It's worse than you think," Silva began, his voice low. "Clark isn't the only one involved. There are at least a dozen officers in the precinct who are in on this. They're all working with Garrison, taking payments under the table to target specific neighborhoods. They harass residents, arrest them on bogus charges, or just make life hell for them until they leave." Omer's jaw tightened as he listened, his hands clenching into fists. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside made it all the more real. "They're falsifying reports, covering their tracks," Silva continued. "Most of the complaints never even make it to Iowa. The captain's in on it too, Roberts. He's been looking the other way for years." "Roberts?" Omer asked, his voice sharp. He had known Roberts for years, had worked alongside him in court cases, had trusted him. The revelation stung. Silva nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, Judge, but Roberts is as deep in this as anyone. He's been getting kickbacks from Garrison for years. That's why no one ever gets punished." Daryl scribbled furiously, his pen moving across the page with urgency. This was the break they had been waiting for, confirmation of the corruption they had long suspected. "We need to go public with this," Daryl said, looking up from his notes. "This is too big to keep under wraps. We need to blow the lid off this entire operation." Omer nodded in agreement, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "And then what? Garrison is powerful. The police department is corrupt from top to bottom. Even if we expose them, what's to stop them from coming after us?" Daryl leaned forward, his eyes locked on Omer's. "We have the truth on our side. Once this gets out, once the media picks it up, there will be no way for them to bury it. They'll have to answer for what they've done." Silva shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't so sure. He had seen what happened to people who crossed Garrison, how their lives were ruined, how they were silenced. But he had come too far to back out now. "Okay," Silva said finally, his voice shaking slightly. "I'll testify. I'll go on record. But you need to protect me." Omer and Daryl exchanged a glance. They knew what Silva was risking by coming forward, and they knew that they would have to do everything in their power to keep him safe. "You have our word," Omer said, his voice solemn. "We'll protect you." Within days, the story broke. Omer and Daryl held a press conference outside the courthouse, flanked by a group of local activists and reporters. Silva's testimony had given them the ammunition they needed, and they weren't going to waste it. Omer stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He could see the cameras flashing, the microphones held up high, waiting for him to speak. He knew that what he was about to say could change everything, not just for him, but for the entire city. "Good morning," Omer began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Judge Omer Jackson, and today I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a citizen of this city. A city that has long been plagued by corruption, by injustice, and by the abuse of power." The crowd murmured, the air thick with anticipation. For too long, the people of this city, particularly Black and Latino residents, have been targeted by a police department that no longer serves to protect them, but to oppress them. Officers like Jennifer Clark have been working with real estate developers like Matthew Garrison to force people out of their homes, to make life so unbearable that they have no choice but to leave. Omer held up a thick stack of documents, police reports, financial records, Silva's testimony, all the evidence they had compiled over the past few weeks. These documents tell the story of a city corrupted from the inside out, a city where the police have become nothing more than tools for the wealthy, used to drive out the poor and the vulnerable. The cameras flashed, the reporters scribbling notes, hanging on every word. "This ends today," Omer said, his voice rising. "We are filing a lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Matthew Garrison. We will not stop until every single one of them is held accountable." The crowd erupted into applause, chants of justice filling the air. But as Omer stepped away from the podium, a sense of unease settled over him. He had made his move, but the game was far from over. Garrison wasn't going to go down without a fight, and neither was the police department. They had drawn their line in the sand. Now they would have to see it through. Chapter 6: Unraveling the System. The days that followed the press conference were a whirlwind. The media latched onto the story with a ferocity that Omer hadn't anticipated. Headlines screamed of corruption, racial profiling, and police misconduct. Protesters flooded the streets, demanding justice for the victims of Garrison's gentrification scheme and the abuse they had endured at the hands of the police. The city was in chaos, but for Omer, the real battle was just beginning. The lawsuit they had filed was moving forward, but it was a slow and grueling process. Omer and Daryl spent hours preparing the case, gathering more evidence, interviewing witnesses, and working to ensure that their case was airtight. Silva's testimony had been a crucial turning point, but they needed more. And as they delved deeper into the corruption, they began to uncover more than they had ever expected. It wasn't just Officer Clark or Captain Roberts who were involved. The corruption extended far beyond the precinct. It reached into the highest levels of city government. Garrison had been bribing city officials for years, paying them off to ensure that his development projects moved forward without interference. He had his hands in everything, from zoning laws to building permits to the police force itself, and the more they uncovered, the more dangerous things became. Late one night, Omer was driving home from the courthouse when he noticed the headlights behind him. They had been following him for miles, keeping a steady distance but never falling back. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned onto a side street, hoping to lose them, but the car followed. Panic surged through him. He had been careful, but it seemed that his enemies were closing in. He pushed the accelerator, trying to put some distance between himself and the car, but it stayed close, tailing him through every turn. Just as Omer's mind began to race through his options, calling the police, pulling over, the car suddenly veered off down a different street, disappearing into the night. Omer's hands shook as he pulled over, his breath coming in shallow gasps. They were watching him. They were sending a message. When he arrived home, he didn't tell Leah about what had happened. She had enough to worry about, but the next morning he called Daryl. "They're getting desperate," Omer said, his voice low. "I was followed last night." Daryl swore under his breath. "We need to be careful, Omer. Garrison isn't going to go down easy. He's going to try everything to stop us." But Omer was resolute. "We keep going. We're too close to stop now. If you're interested, don't forget to subscribe and like it." Inside the police department, the pressure was mounting as well. Officer Silva was feeling the heat from his colleagues. Since his conversation with Omer, he had been walking a tightrope, trying to keep his head down while feeding information to the lawsuit. But it was becoming harder to stay under the radar. Clark and Roberts were growing suspicious. Silva had noticed the way they looked at him, the subtle questions they asked, the sideways glances in the locker room. They knew something was up, and Silva knew it was only a matter of time before they figured out what he had done. One night, after his shift, Silva was called into Roberts' office. The captain was sitting behind his desk, his face stern, his eyes cold. "Close the door," Roberts said, his voice quiet but commanding. Silva obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've been acting strange lately, Silva," Roberts said, leaning back in his chair. "You're not hiding something, are you?" Silva's mouth went dry. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his expression neutral. "No, sir, just been busy with work." Roberts raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so? Because I've heard some interesting things." "Rumors, mostly." Rumors about certain people talking to certain people they shouldn't be talking to. Silva's stomach dropped. He knew what Roberts was getting at, but he wasn't about to fold. Not now. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," Silva said, his voice steady, though inside he was shaking. Roberts stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "You're a good cop, Silva. Don't screw that up." Silva nodded, feeling the sweat bead on his forehead. "I won't, sir." But as he left Roberts's office, Silva knew that his time was running out. He had already crossed the line, and now there was no going back. Chapter 7. The Courtroom Showdown. The day of the trial arrived with the weight of a storm brewing on the horizon. Omer had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but as he stood outside the courthouse, his heart still raced. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for, everything they had uncovered. The corruption, the abuse, the lies, it was all about to come to light. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras and notebooks at the ready. Activists and community members sat in the audience, their eyes fixed on the proceedings, their hopes resting on the outcome of the trial. Omer sat at the plaintiff's table with Daryl beside him, their case laid out in front of them, stacks of documents, files, and evidence meticulously organized. Across from them, the city's defense attorneys sat with Garrison's legal team, their faces calm but tense. They knew what was at stake. As the trial began, Omer felt a surge of adrenaline. He watched as Daryl laid out their opening arguments, presenting the evidence they had gathered, the falsified police reports, the financial records linking Garrison to the police department, Silva's testimony about the harassment of black residents. It was a powerful case, and as Daryl spoke, Omer could see the impact it was having on the jury. They were listening, they were paying attention. But the defense wasn't going down without a fight. They attacked Silva's credibility, painting him as a disgruntled officer looking to save his own skin. They tried to poke holes in the financial records, suggesting that Garrison's payments to the police were for security services and nothing more. They even tried to discredit Omer himself, bringing up his past cases and questioning his motives. It was brutal, and at times, Omer wondered if they would be able to hold the case together. But Daryl was relentless. He countered every argument, every accusation, with calm precision. He knew the law inside and out, and he wasn't about to let the defense tear their case apart. And then, the moment came. Silva took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he walked to the witness stand, his face pale but determined. This was it, the moment of truth. Everything hinged on his testimony. Daryl approached the stand, his voice steady. "Officer Silva, can you tell the court what you witnessed during your time in the precinct?" Silva nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "I witnessed officers, including Officer Clark, harass residents in certain neighborhoods, mostly black and Latino residents. They would stop them without cause, write false reports, and in some cases arrest them on bogus charges." The courtroom murmured, the weight of Silva's words hanging in the air. "And why did they do this?" Daryl asked. Silva took a deep breath. Because they were being paid by Matthew Garrison. He wanted to drive out the residents so he could buy up the properties for cheap. The defense attorneys immediately objected, but the damage had been done. Silva's testimony was a bombshell, and there was no putting it back in the box. For hours, Silva detailed everything he had seen, how the corruption had spread through the department, how officers like Clark and Roberts had been in Garrison's pocket, how the city had turned a blind eye to the abuse for years. By the time he finished, the courtroom was in shock, and then the final blow came. Daryl called Omer to the stand. Omer hadn't expected to testify, but Daryl had insisted. The jury needed to hear from him, the man who had started it all, the man who had been stopped in his own neighborhood and had uncovered the truth. As Omer took the stand, he felt the eyes of the entire courtroom on him. He took a deep breath and began. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice," Omer said, his voice clear and unwavering. "But what I've uncovered in this case goes beyond anything I've seen before. This isn't just about a few bad cops. This is about a system that has been corrupted to its core, a system that has preyed on the most vulnerable in our city for too long." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. "But it ends here, today." Chapter 8. Aftermath and resolution. The jury deliberated for days, the tension in the city mounting with each passing hour. Protests continued to fill the streets, and the media coverage remained relentless. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. And then, finally, it came. The jury found in favor of Ulmer and the plaintiffs. The city was ordered to pay millions in damages, and sweeping reforms were mandated for the police department. Officers like Clark and Roberts were arrested, and Garrison was charged with multiple counts of bribery and fraud. It was a victory, a hard-fought, long-awaited victory. But as Ulmer stood outside the courthouse, watching the reporters swarm Daryl for quotes, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. They had won, yes, but the cost had been high. His family had been put through hell, and there were still scars that would take time to heal. That night, as he sat on the porch with Leah, watching the sunset, Ulmer reflected on everything that had happened. "I'm proud of you," Leah said quietly, her hand resting on his arm. "You did the right thing." Ulmer smiled, though there was a sadness behind his eyes. "It's not over, Leah. The system is still broken. There's still so much work to be done." Leah nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we keep fighting." Ulmer glanced over at Malik and Alana, who were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air. He had done this for them, for their future, for the world they would grow up in. But he knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The city had changed, yes. But there was still so much more to do, and Ulmer was ready. He would keep fighting for his family, for his community, for justice, because that was who he was. As Ulmer watched his children playing under the evening sky, he knew the fight for justice was far from over, but this victory was a step forward, a spark of hope in a system long shrouded in darkness. He would continue the fight, for his family, and for all those whose voices had been silenced for too long. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters,